This episode of The Candid Frame is sponsored by Charcoal Book Club. The Charcoal Book Club is a monthly subscription service for photo book enthusiasts. Working with the most respected names in contemporary photography, Charcoal selects and delivers essential photo books to a worldwide community of collectors. Each month, members receive a signed first edition monograph and an exclusive print to add to their collections. Each month, members receive a signed first edition monograph and an exclusive print to add to their collections. Join the club by visiting charcoalbookclub.com and use the promo code TheCandidFrame at checkout and receive a 10% discount on your first membership payment. I've been reading a book about the history of photography. It's been interesting to take a deep dive into the story of photography. It's fascinating to learn about the cultural, political, and social events surrounding not only the creation of photography, but how over time it shaped as well as helped shape the way we see each other and ourselves. When it comes to the photographic process, we have it easy today, as compared to those original photographers who worked with glass and metal plates and sometimes very toxic chemistry. So it surprises me to find photographers today who have fully invested in these old photographic processes. Shane Balkowitsch doesn't just dabble with the Webplate process. It's the only photographic process he's practiced seriously since picking up a camera. He has regularly used the process practiced by less than 1,000 photographers around the world to create powerful and emotional portraits, some of which he has featured in his first book, Northern Plain Native Americans, A Modern Webplate Perspective. Shane's story possesses all the elements of a great story and a wonderful conversation. By the time you're done with this episode, I hope you'll agree. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. Well, first off, Shane, just welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Really good to have you. It's been fascinating looking at your work and finding out your story with not just the book project, but the other work that you've been doing with, this Webplate collodion process. But let's start off with how you found out about this process in the first place, because this was your introduction to photography.
Yeah, I had never had any interest in photography until 2012 when I saw this photograph online, and something just drew me in that I can't really explain to this day. I've been trying to put words around it. I asked what it was, and it was, the gentleman told me it was a wet plate photograph, and I just fell down this rabbit hole within 45 days. I had a 5x7 large format camera built for me by Star Camera Company. I'd never been in a darkroom before, so I had to figure out how to, the process, the wet plate process requires a dark room, so I had to figure out what composes a dark room and what do you do in a dark room. Yeah. And I did all that in about 45 days, and I made my first plate on October 4th, 2012. I just haven't looked back.
Are you usually that kind of a deep diver almost immediately when something sort of really piques your interest?
It seems that way. I was restoring a motorcycle at the time, and I had a deep dive into that. And before that, I had restored a 65 Porsche. But they were, I think they were me starting to figure out how to create. I was completely involved in both these restorations, and if you ask both the builders, Bill Hamilton, who did the Porsche, and Josh Withers, who's a photography friend now, that I just immersed myself in the restorations. And I think it was this search for something creative. What came out of it is me in the researching my motorcycle. Paul DeLorean's, he just did the Vintagent is the largest blog for vintage motorcycles in the world. And he just did a story this week about our story, about where he told me about this wet plate. And then he explained to me what it was. And then I just next thing he knew, I was out there creating. And here we are 8 years later, still friends. And it's just been this unbelievable ride, to be honest.
It seems like all of these, restoring the motorcycle, the car, the wet plate collodion, that part of it was, yes, it's about being creative. It's also trying to figure things out, because each one poses a situation where you'll have a problem or an obstacle that you have to come up with a solution. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that that's part of the fun and the thrill of it, is trying to figure things things out. Do you think that that's a big part of what drives you?
Well, my day job is I'm a CEO, I'm a founder of a .com. So technology since 1998. I mean, I've been immersed in technology, and I think the bike and the motorcycle and the wet plating is the furthest thing from technology we have. These aren't modern. Yeah. These aren't modern things that we're working on for the vehicles and the process. So there's something tangible about the analog. There's something tangible there that you just don't get in digital form. And I don't know if there's any crossover from those things, but I know, and again, this is in hindsight and retrospective. I'm looking back. I think I was searching for, as soon as I finished the car, I was yearning to continue this creative process. So it was right onto a motorcycle, and I had never owned a motorcycle or anything at that point. So, you asked me about, I'd never driven I don't laugh. I had never driven a motorcycle. So I find myself restoring a 1971 BMW cafe racer from the ground up, and I'd never had been in a Porsche either before my car. So my car, it took 3 years to restore that car with Bill Hamilton. I bought it unseen in New York. It went down to Texas, and there it was restored. So the first time I ever sat in a Porsche was my fully restored 1965 Porsche 356. So yeah, if you ask my wife, in the documentary, she kind of alludes to that it's kind of my MO of doing this kind of crazy deep dive stuff. But I find myself, this isn't something that I'm coming out from. Like I really found like there's something very meaningful to this photography thing that I'm, whatever it is, however you want to describe it. And I had 13 students out today from Bismarck State College today for a demonstration. And, I told them, you just got to find your passion. You just got to, keep searching. I was 44 years of age. No talent whatsoever. I can't paint. I don't, I'm not a poet. I don't have any talents. And here I find myself on this path, but it's very meaningful to me. And it's not like, oh, this is a fad and I'm going to move on to something else.
Yeah.
I'm stuck here now. And I just feel like I don't have enough time now to do everything that I want to do with this process. But I can't have any regrets.
Yeah. For people who are not familiar with the wet collodion process, why don't you briefly explain what it is?
Yeah, so it's like the great-great-grandfather of photography. A real quick history lesson, the daguerreotype was one of the first photographic processes that became commercialized where people could have their portraits taken. It was about 1838. Louis Daguerre, a Frenchman, invented that. They were polishing a piece of copper to a high polished finish, and they were using some mercury, and they were heating it up, and they were getting these images. And it was like the first time that you could go get your portrait taken. But you understand that it was such a significant scientific achievement photography was at the time. So about 10 years later, Frederick Scott Archer, in about 1848, we think he started, and he published and it wasn't a long document, but in The Chemist was a scientific journal. He shared the wet plate collodion process with the world. So he had worked on that for a couple of years, and he had developed a new way of taking pictures, and it was revolutionary. And quickly the daguerreotype was set aside, and everyone was doing wet plating. And wet plating only went around. So his name was Frederick Scott Archer. It was only popular for about 35 years. By about 1885, they figured out how to get from the wet plate to the dry plate. And to explain to your listeners, the wet plate, I have to pour the plate. I actually make the emulsion and pour it on the plate in the field or in my studio. So I'm actually making a piece of, for instance, sheet film on a piece of glass out of silver nitrate. So, but it's on a piece of glass. Or, if your listeners know about tintypes, I mean, most people know about this process. Yeah. What a tintype is. Don't be confused. I'm an ambrotypist, which means eternal impression. It just means that I make my wet plates on glass instead of tin. So the tintype and the wet plate process, they're all the same. And I'm just an ambrotypist because I make something on a piece of glass. There's something about the fragility. If I took your portrait, you came into my studio and I took your portrait on a piece of tin, which I've done, or a piece of glass, and said, which one do you want? And I handed them both to you. I can't imagine you'd ever pick the piece of tin over this delicate, heavy piece of glass. There's just something very romantic about these processes. And the fact that you have to covet the image, it's fragile. If you drop it, it breaks and you lose it. So you would think, well, that's a bad thing. You'd rather have something tin. You could throw a tintype across the room and it will survive. But that's not the point. The point is, there's something there's something important about protecting or taking care of your images. And on glass, it's where I find myself. So in about 1885, they figured out, because once I pour the chemicals onto the plate and immerse it in silver nitrate, if that plate dries before the exposure, I lose the image. So I can't let that plate ever dry. So you have to do everything. Once you pour the plate, you have to go through all these steps, all the way through the exposure, the development, the fixing, the rinsing, the drying. That all has to occur, and then you get your image. There isn't taking a shot, going back to the studio 4 hours later, you know what I mean, and developing something. So in 1885, dry plate came around, where you could buy from Kodak Eastman, you could buy dry plates that were already sensitized in sleeves, and you would just take them out in the field, and you could take 50 pictures in the afternoon, keep them in the dark, and put them away, and then come back to your studio weeks and months later and develop and fix them and stuff. And as soon as you freed yourself up from the darkroom, the wet plate process became obsolete. And that's really what was I feel is one of the main contributors to the process falling off in 1885, is because a photographer could now, take his camera and his plates and go out on the road and not have to worry about carrying a darkroom. When I'm on the road with my wet plate camera, I have to have a darkroom. I got a germination tent. It's about the size of a 50-gallon aquarium that I climb into with my head and pull a shroud over me. I got these little red bicycle lights. So I actually have to have a darkroom in the back of my vehicle developing the plates on spot, which is a daunting task. It's a really daunting task.
And over 100 years ago, guys had their darkrooms in wagons.
Yeah, they had them in wagons. And what they did, and they didn't have these electric lights. I used just bicycle lights, red bicycle lights for my safe lights in my darkroom. But they would just have a piece of red stained glass. They'd cut out a hole in the back of their box, whatever their darkroom was, their portable darkroom, and the light would come through the stained glass. So the red safe light would come through, and they'd have to use the sun. So there was never taking photographs out, at night in the Victorian era. I mean, there was only one light source strong enough to make photographs, and that was the sun. So there was no photography at night or anything like that. So you were really, back in the day, you were really stuck for what time of the days you could create and so forth. Like I had the students in earlier today, and their class was like 10 o'clock in the morning, and even in my natural light studio, I just did not have enough light coming in yet because of the early morning and what time of the year it was. I had to turn on a continuous bulb here. But Frederick Scott Archer couldn't go to a bank of continuous bulbs and turn them on and create. You either used the sun or you didn't.
But as you mentioned before, that you had a camera built specifically for this purpose, and there are not that many people who do this on a regular basis. They're probably around 1,000, if that.
Right, that's about the number we're stuck on. Yep.
Yeah. So in terms of the resources, the chemistry, and all those things that you would need, where do you go? I mean, it's not like you can go to your local camera store and pick up all this.
No, but just like there was back in the Victorian era, there's purveyors of wet plate chemicals today. So I've got all the recipes I can get all the raw chemicals from any chemistry shop and make my, get my collodion. Collodion was, do you know anything about collodion, the medical application of collodion? So it was used to seal wounds shut back in the Victorian era. It was, if you had a bottle of ether, if you were a doctor, you had a bottle of ether, and you'd go to your gunsmith and you'd ask him for gun cotton, the wadding at the end of the rifle. You would just put that in your bottle of ether and you make collodion. So if you've got a cut on your arm or a wound, puncture wound or something, you'd pour the collodion on there and hold it shut, and it would seal the wound without any stitches. So that was the medical application. Archer did not invent collodion. He knew about this magical kind of like gluey substance, and he figured out where his solution was. If he added bromide, he knew that there was an affinity between bromide, the salt, and silver nitrate, that he could get silver nitrate to jump out of a silver nitrate bath and impregnate this collodion, and that's how he made photosensitive plates. So that was the real technological achievement of Archer, was figuring this attraction between bromide and silver, and figuring out using collodion, this glue, this syrupy kind of solution, to adhere the silver molecules onto the plate.
Yeah. And it's a very time restrictive process. You only have minutes after you've coated the surface of the glass in order to expose it to light and to process it. And you can read about a technique, but when you actually have to do it, it's a different story. I mean, it's one thing to read the historical record or historical account of this, and then it's one thing to actually practice it. So there's a couple of very beautiful things about the wet plate process that I could share if you don't mind. The first thing is that these images are made out of pure silver on glass.
So silver does not degrade. Silver will be here 1,000 years from now. These plates will be here 1,000 years from now unbroken. They do not fade. They do not deteriorate. Our inks and our pigments and our paints and everything else that we make images out of, those all, have issues with time. And the analogy that I use with the students when they come out is if you put a silver spoon on the ground and come back 500 years, what's on the ground? And the answer has to be a silver spoon. And so these images are completely archival. The Pitt Rivers Museum at the University of Oxford has taken 30 of my Native American plates next week. They just did a selection of them, and they will go over to their museum, and they will be there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after I'm gone. I have historic wet plates here, examples of 160-year-old plates, and they look as good today as they did the day they were made. So it's that whole thing is when you're making objects that are going to be here long after you're gone, and you think about it romantically, it just takes photography to a different level.
Yeah. And it's a completely different experience in terms of making a portrait along those lines. I sat for a tintype sometime last year.
Oh, okay.
And it was great. And it was really interesting to sit in front of the camera in that way rather than just with a contemporary camera where it's like 125th of a second. You just sit there and it's over, and you're sitting there waiting as the exposure is made in front of you. You're looking into the lens. And because of the time that it takes for everything to get set up, it was really interesting in terms of just me being present in the moment, as opposed to just like posing for a second and making the photograph. It's a really interesting dynamic from the subject point of view. But I'd love for you to talk about what do you think that dynamic creates for in your experience, as opposed to, the way that most people today make a portrait.
Well, I think when you dabble in these longer exposures, like you said, do you remember how long your exposure was by any chance?
Oh, it wasn't very long.
Okay, because you were outside maybe, or were you?
We were outside, yeah.
Outside, yeah. So, just to give your listeners an idea of exposure times, outdoors, f8 will be about 3 seconds. Guess. I mean, when I took Greta Thunberg's wet plate, I hit it on the mark with that. If I'm in my studio today, when I took the students' plates, I took 2 plates today. It was 10 full seconds of exposure. So your iPhone is open for about 1/60th of a second. So 10 full seconds would take 600 times longer to take a wet plate than it does with the iPhone in your back pocket. And when you look at that, I'm actually taking a movie of you. All the images you've seen in the book that I sent you and so forth, my Native American, those are 10-second movies of every person. They just happen to be still lifes. Because what we do know, I'm an oncology nurse as well, we do know that the heart was beating. We knew that a couple shallow breaths occurred. We knew that there may be one quick blink. And what was very beautiful about this and what I just adore about this is I think is when people sometimes see my work, they see the thought that person was having as I was taking their exposure. So it's not this sliver of time that you could almost argue that's not, that 1/60th of a second is not any part of my life. You can't deny that I have 10 seconds of your life on that piece of glass. And, like I said, I've fallen down this rabbit hole. I'm a hopeless romantic when it comes to this. These are the ways that I look at these things, but I didn't always see it this way. This is after reflection and trying to understand what it is that's happening here in my studio. And trying to explain this, because everyone who comes in, like, I don't know when you got your tintype, but when people come in, I give them I give them the history of photography. I tell them what we're doing. It's all a collaboration. They come in and I explain every process to them, because I think when they see those images and I take your portrait, I think there's some meaning that gets added to that portrait, because they understand that this portrait was made from hand. Out of hand, like an artist's hand. Like my glass is all cut by hand. I grab a ruler and a $3 glass cutter, and I cut my glass. And sometimes it's kittywampus and it's not perfectly. And I could have a machine cut everything 8x10 and 5x7 or whatever format I want perfectly. I could do that. I have no interest in that. I like if you look at one of my plates and it's a little wobbly. There's something about the imperfections of that, and it shows no different than like if a painter made his own canvas. You grab the board and you stretch the canvas or something like that. There's something more special about that than if a painter just went and bought something off the shelf. So there's something about that.
The first ones that you made were of your brother and your wife, and tell me about some of the things that you learned from those early plates.
Well, my brother Chad, people have asked me why was he your first subject, and it was, well, he was the only guy standing around at the time, so he works with me out at the business, and I had my little camera set up and my 2 light fixtures. I had no idea what I was doing, none whatsoever. I didn't know anything about exposure times. I got to be honest, I don't even think I understood that I was actually using light to actually make photographs at the beginning. I mean, that's how much of a simple thing. If you've never taken a class, you've never read a book, you've never had any introduction by anyone into photography, you got to, you put yourself in that place. It's a different place than when you come to this through normal course of learning about photography and the different elements of photography. So I had no perspective on any photography whatsoever. So we just guessed on that exposure, and his image came to life, and it was, we were jumping up and down, and we were excited, and it was just at that moment I was hooked. And I do, so that was October 4th, 2012, and I take his portrait on that day every year. So I have 9 portraits of my brother on that day celebrating that first plate. And it's all, the first portrait is, he had his shirt off and there's a black background. And it's a 5x7. So I haven't changed the format. And I got my brother as he's aged through the years. And the idea for this series, it's called My Brother Through the Years, is I'm going to, upon my death or upon my brother's death, it will go to his oldest daughter, the entire series, however many plates we get to. So it's something that we work on, and every year, October's coming up, and he has to find a way into my studio. So it's kind of interesting seeing him change throughout the years. And during this series, he had lost his wife to cancer and so forth. And it's telling. The images are telling that you can look at them, and you can almost see where he was having difficulties in his life.
It's interesting. I was reading recently that the image in the mirror that we see is not really the way people see us. That somehow the mirror is actually creating a slight distortion, and there are certain mirrors that are out there that will actually reveal to you how other people see you, and a lot of people are shocked when they see that because they're so used to their reflection. And I know that from my experience getting the tintype made, I saw myself in a completely different way, not just because of the inherent nature of that particular process, but there was just something about the image that in many ways kind of surprised me.
It doesn't lie.
Yeah.
It doesn't lie somewhere. It doesn't lie. We talked about the archivability of these plates and that tintype that you have, and it'll be here long after you're gone. But there's another thing that we can talk about briefly is the resolution of these images. So we're making these images in molecules of silver, and I don't know if there's the other photographer that took your wet plate explained this to you, but molecules of silver, it takes about 2 billion molecules of silver at the tip of your finger to actually visualize it with the human eye. So that tintype that you have, you could take it to any university, ask for their most high-powered microscope, and put your tintype under that microscope, and you will not get to the pixel or grain that makes up that image. So that photograph is that tintype of you is the most high-resolution photograph that's ever been taken of you in your life and will ever be taken of you. Wow. You need an electron microscope to get to the pixel or grain of a wet plate. Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't. That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing? Do you know silver, the compound, the metal silver, the heavy metal, is it native to Earth? Do you know?
Oh, I have no idea.
It's not. There was never enough energy in the creation of Earth, and I hope I'm not getting off the subject here, but I'm trying to throw some things that I adore about this process. Okay, so there was never enough energy in the formation of Earth to ever create any of the heavy metals, the nickels, the platinums, the golds, the silvers. None of them. They were all brought here by meteors or comets.
Wow.
Okay, so the only place that the heavy metals have ever been formed are when a star explodes, and that's where there's enough energy. And that's why we can't make gold here on Earth, because we don't have enough energy to make gold. We can't make lead here on Earth because we don't have enough energy to make lead. So you have to have the explosion of a star. That's the only time when a supernova explodes. That's when enough energy is used to make these heavier elements. Then they get blown out into the universe. They stick to some extraterrestrial body that's going through, and then it collides with Earth. And that's why you have pockets of gold like in San Francisco and Alaska. It's not because there's something special about that. It's just that's where a large meteorite with a bunch of gold collided with Earth and spread its debris everywhere. So all the images that I make are made out of this cosmic dust.
That's fantastic.
So these images, they're made out of the only way so silver molecules made it onto the plate is being transported here by a comet or meteorite or extraterrestrial body colliding with Earth. Isn't that just?
Wow, that is awesome.
It's cool, right?
So tell me about the book. So you call it a modern wet plate perspective.
Yes. I captured, just by happenstance, I was trying to research a wet plate photographer by the name of Orlando Scott Goff here in Bismarck. So you start doing this process and you start wondering, I wonder if there's someone else back in the Victorian era that was actually a photographer in Bismarck doing wet plated. And sure enough, I found this gentleman, Orlando Scott Goff was his name. Never anything written about the man or anything, but I found newspaper clippings and stuff like that. But what's attributed to Goff, which is where his big achievement is he took the very first photograph of Sitting Bull. Now, Sitting Bull went on to have multiple photographs taken of him over his life. In fact, Sitting Bull realized that this was an income source for him, that if he could find a photographer and they knew that he was Sitting Bull, that they would pay him money to sit. So Sitting Bull had used this as an income source. So Orlando Scott Goff, after Sitting Bull had come back from Canada, he was exiled into Canada and came back into the States. Orlando Scott Goff knew he was coming through Bismarck and offered him $50. Which is equivalent to about $1,800 in today's money to sit for him. So Sitting Bull came in. We don't know exactly. We know that Goff had a studio in downtown Bismarck, and I drive by it every day going to work. It's in the Blockhouse building. But we know that Sitting Bull came in, and the story is that Sitting Bull, he gave him the $50. Sitting Bull came in and gave him that one exposure, walked out the door. But what was most important is that it's the first ever time. Everything before that was paintings or drawings or sketches of the man. Right. This is the first ever photograph. So I've learned about that. And then through that, I learned about the Smithsonian Institute. I read an article where they had some leggings, and I want to say a tuft of hair of Sitting Bull's, that they wanted to give back to Sitting Bull's family, that they thought these were personal items, and that they wanted to give these items back to Sitting Bull's family, modern day family, and his relatives. So it was like a 7-year exhaustive search finding the rightful owner, the oldest living person that they could come up with. And it was Ernie LaPointe, the great grandson of Sitting Bull. And Ernie had told them early on when they came snooping around the first time that he was, but they had to do their due diligence over this time, because you could about imagine the dollar value on leggings of Sitting Bull. I mean, you were talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, leggings of Sitting Bulls. So the Smithsonian identified Ernie LaPointe, and they gave those leggings and those personal items back to his family through Ernie. I found out about Ernie and found out that he was only about 150 miles away from me in Leeds, South Dakota. I called him on the phone. He picked up the phone, and I said, Ernie, I'm Shane Balkowitsch. I'm a wet plate photographer. I explained Goff to him. He says, well, I know about Goff. He knew about the photograph, obviously. Mm-hmm. I wasn't telling him anything. And I said, will you come into my studio 135 years after your great-grandfather did and have your portrait taken in the same process that Goff took your great-grandfather's photograph? And he was in within a week. And to this day, we're dear friends. So that one portrait that I had never had a Native American friend or acquaintance or anything up to that point, and Ernie LaPointe came in and gave me that chance. And it's called Eternal Field in that book. There's the picture he's standing out in the field.
Yeah.
What you don't know about it, if you look at that, it's Eternal Field, Ernie LaPointe wet plate. There's a waste management dumpster just like 5-10 feet out of frame. There were semis and cars. There's a interstate freeway right behind him where I was taking his portrait. He was looking at me like, this guy's crazy. How's this going to turn out? There was cars driving by Ernie during the exposure, but they were just moving too fast to see it. But there's no evidence of any of that. Only I like telling that story because it's fun to tell the story of what actually was going on in that exposure. You think that he's standing out. This is a field just outside of my warehouse, and I was able to capture this iconic photograph of Ernie LaPointe, my very good friend. And he's we just talked this week, so book number 2 is coming out. I called it it's called Northern Plains Native Americans: A Modern Wet Plate Perspective. It's pretty much sold out now. I had 1,000 copies, and there were some 2,000 trade edition copies, and then they're almost gone too, I believe. They went out to Barnes and Noble and stuff. But so I'm starting on book 2. So the goal is a 20-year journey to capture 1,000 Native Americans in the process. So it all started with my good friend Ernie, and I'm at plate 451, and I've been working on this for about 7 years now. Like this Friday, I've got 5 Native Americans coming in and sitting. I had a gentleman 2 weeks ago flew in from California. I've had people come from as far as Florida to have their portraits taken for this series. So I call it a modern wet plate perspective because I wanted to. We're not pretending that these people are in the Victorian era. All the regalia and everything that you see. Some people think that I'm like we're playing dress up or like I have props here or something like that. It's nothing like that. Are you familiar with Edward Curtis and his Native American?
Oh yeah, because I know that was one of the controversies in terms.
It was one of the controversies, and I was aware of this. So I don't in all my Native American portraits, nothing's ever introduced. So they either bring it in or it's not used. And I've been very, very strict with that. So, I would never hand someone a bow or a spear or, there's times that I've done creative work, but if it's for the series, the actual series, I never introduce anything. They have to bring it or it's not used. So I'm trying to keep the integrity of it.
This fall, I have been buying a lot of photo books, both by well-known photographers and people who are completely new to me. It's been an important way not only for me to spend my time, but also to train my eyes to see a little differently. I learned so much looking at images on a printed page, and that's completely different than when I'm looking at a screen, be it on my phone or a computer. When I sit down in my chair with that book in my lap, I'm fully dedicated to immersing myself in that photographer's work. That's one of the reasons I'm so happy to have Charcoal Book Club as a sponsor. They curate and offer books from great contemporary photographers. Because of their special relationships with publishers and these photographers, they offer you first edition signed copies of some of these photographers' books delivered to you each month. They offer free shipping to the US, Canada, and the UK. It's subsidized elsewhere. And if you're not feeling that month's selection, that's okay. You can swap it for a different one of similar value. Do yourself a favor. Visit their website to see what they've offered in the past and what you have to look forward to. Join the club at charcoalbookclub.com today. And remember, use the promo code TheCandidFrame at checkout and receive a 10% discount on your first membership payment. And thanks to the many of you who have chosen to support the Candid Frame financially this year. Your contributions have allowed us to continue to produce the show on a weekly basis and meet all the costs of production. If you've enjoyed this season but haven't contributed yet, it's not too late, and it's easy to do by becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do that by contributing $5, $10, $20 or more a month by visiting patreon.com/TheCandidFrame. Just $5 a month will make a big difference for us. Thank you as always for your support. So how did this one portrait turn into this idea and this series that's becoming a life's work?
Well, the State Historical Society, I offered it to the State Historical Society of North Dakota, so that's a very important portrait for me for these archives. And that was the first portrait that went into the state archive. So they said, yes, we would love to take the Webplate of Ernie Lapointe into our archive. And that started it all. I've got about 650 plates with them so far. A bunch of my Native American, all my Native American portraits for the series. But I do have other, personal plates and stuff like that. And so that was the first archive. They just kind of they identified that I was from here and that I was doing something significant. When we first started with the State Historical Society, they would have to approve. I mean, it's expensive to curate plates indefinitely. I mean, it's a huge honor if you can imagine. So they would have to have this approval process by which they would say, okay, well, what do you want to give? What do you want to donate or whatever? And I would tell them, and then they would say yay or nay. But then I took that photograph of Evander Holyfield, the 4-time heavyweight champion of the world, and the Smithsonian took that into their archive. And the next Monday after the State Historical Society heard that the Smithsonian took Evander, they sent me a nice little email saying, by the way, Shane, we'll accept anything that you're willing to donate from here on out, which was really important for me because then I could get my creative work in there. It wasn't just what they wanted to get in there. Like I've got portraits of my children. I've got some of my creative pieces in there. So it unlocked the door. So Ernie's plate unlocked the door for me. Tomorrow I'm traveling to the State Historical Society. I've got 18 plates in a box that's going to be gifted. It's a gift from me in my studio to the residents of North Dakota, and it's just a huge honor. And then it just slowly, there's 27 archives around the world that have my work, including the Heard Museum. The Library of Congress has the Greta Thunberg. I mentioned the Pitt Rivers Museum. So there's different. The Nordiska Museet in Sweden has the other Greta plate. So I've got these 27 archives around the world that are curating my work. But it all started with that portrait of Ernie Lapointe. He knocked down the door not only for the Historical Society here, but then that opened the door for other historical societies.
There's a woman who writes one of the prefaces in the book.
Margaret?
Yeah, Margaret?
Margaret, yep.
Yeah, tell us about her and her role in making this happen.
Well, she's my sister. She was one of my early sitters, had come in, Margaret Yellowbird, and she came in and she just really enjoyed the process. And that you got to understand that when I first started, I was just going to do 10 portraits of Native Americans. I thought that was going to be quite the achievement. Like, how does this gentleman that doesn't have any friends in this community going to earn the trust of 10 Native Americans and get these 10 portraits? And then Margaret came along and she brought friends and other friends, and she just she put her name out there on my behalf and vouched for me. And people just started coming in. And so Margaret came out, sat for me, and then she said, "Can I come out again?" And she just kept coming out. So a lot of those first early Native American portraits was Margaret was there, and she was making sure the regalia was right, and she was helping me with the composition and making sure feathers were right and that everything was respected and everything like that. And then at some point, it got to the point where Calvin Grinnell, the Hidatsa elder, had called me on the phone and says, "I've got your name." I said, "Well, what do you mean, Calvin?" He says, "Well, I have your name." I said, "Well, I don't know what you mean." He says, "I have your Native American name." So he says, "I'd like to have a formal ceremony in your studio next weekend." So with exchanging of gifts and witnesses in the whole 9 yards. And he had that for ceremony for me and gave me the name Shadowcatcher, which is Meshdeakagocha in Hidatsa. So at that point, the largest honor of my life, bar none, receiving this name. But at that point, now people know me as Shadowcatcher, and now they don't come in as complete strangers. They come into my studio as sisters and brothers of mine. And it's amazing experience. Like, I'll have people come in from Wisconsin, and when they walk in, it's like I'm their brother. And so it just, something changed. And I was really dedicated to the series prior to my naming ceremony, but after this, I cannot let them down. It's been something that I'm really determined to get to that 1,000 portraits, but it's going to take me 15 to 20 years to get there.
It's a life-changing effort. How you were talking about the project in terms of it being representative of 250 images, that each one will be 50 will be selected for each book. So you'd have a total of 4 books.
I was going to put all 250 images in each book, and so represent every image, but the book was going to be over $200. And I couldn't do that. Nobody's going to buy a $200 book. So I had to do some kind of editing, and I decided that I was going to pick my favorite 50 images of the 250 and do each volume. So when it's all said and done, we'll have 4 volumes on it seems like a long time away from now, though. I mean, I can do an entire Friday's work and just get 1 plate, So as you said, you're running a normal business, and it's Friday is your day to dedicated time for shooting and doing all the work that you do for that. And, you're also married and you raise some kids. Yeah, we've got four children. My wife, Bonnie, we've been together nearly 20 years. So I built the studio here on my property at our house. So you walk down the hill about 75 yards, and the studio's right here because I just wanted it to be, at our home so that, I can run down here. It's like this safe haven, this natural light studio. I can come down here and it's like an epicenter too for creativity. I leave the door open for artists, painters and photographers, and anyone who wants to. Videographers have come in here, and I just leave the door open and they come in and use the space because it's just, I'm so fortunate to be able to pull something like this off.
Yeah, because initially you had made the images in a warehouse, and you were using basically artificial light to provide the illumination, and then you basically built a daylight studio along the lines of what they used in the 19th century.
Yeah, so there's a book written by a Dr. Raymer in 1906, a definitive book on building the best natural light photography studio. So there's schematics and stuff, and he goes into this. It's like a 200-page book on what it is to build the best natural light studio. What do you need to do? So I actually took the pitch and the dimensions from my glass here and incorporated that into my building. So when we built the building, I went around, put a compass on each cornerstone to make sure that this is pointed due north. So you want to be pointed away from the light. So it's all ambient light that's coming into the place, into the space. And then, another technical issue was a modern day glass would not work for this at all. I mean, I need the UV light to this process adores UV. So it's at the UV end of the spectrum, not the infrared end of the spectrum. So all modern day glass, all of it is all UV protected because you don't want your carpets and your couches to fade or your woodwork to fade. So there's always UV protection in all glass. So if I would have used that glass in the studio, I could not you might as well put a brick wall up. So I figured out, it took me 6 months to organize. I figured out the industry that wants as much light into a space is a greenhouse. So there's 3,600 pounds of greenhouse glass above my sitters, and that allows 95% of the natural UV into my space. So my carpets will fade, and the art on the wall will take some damage from this UV. But I need that UV in order to create my images.
In terms of the glass that you used as the surface for the photographs, is there something in particular that you prefer to use?
Black glass. So, you can use, these are positives, I should explain. So I'm making positive images so that, just like that gentleman that made your tintype, that was a piece of tin, you can't put light through it. So, but what a lot of photographers would have done, like when Orlando Scott Goff took that photograph of Sitting Bull, he would not have done a tintype like you did, or he would not have done an amber type like I did, which is black glass, which you can't put any light through. He would have made a clear glass negative. And from that negative, what he can do is he could make contact prints. So he could sell multiple. He could make 1,000 portraits or 1,000 contact prints of Sitting Bull and sell every one of them. It would have done him no good to do a tintype of Sitting Bull because now he's sitting on this one. Remember, they didn't have any technology to duplicate anything. They didn't have a scanner, or there's no way to duplicate these things. The only way that they could duplicate them is by using negatives and making contact prints. So he would have, if it was most photographers, if you're a professional photographer, you would make negatives, clear glass negatives of your sitters. And then your sitters would say, oh, can I go, by the way, you took my picture of grandma 3 years ago. We'd like another print. You come in, I'd pay me another $1 and I'd run you off another print. I'd do another contact print for you. So the photographers, that was the way that they ran their business. They weren't making positives for viewing most of the time. Yeah. They would make a negative so that they could do contact prints, and you could do multiple. So a family could buy 5 portraits of the same shot. You can't do that with your tintype or with my black glass amber type. So yeah, it's just it's stained glass that you'd find like in a church. I buy it in 24 by 24 inch sheets and cut it down to a size to fit inside my camera.
In the documentary that I saw, which really was wonderful, it was very inspiring.
Oh, I'm glad you liked
watching it. But some of the images that I saw you making were these sort of conceptual photographs.
Yeah.
In which you would bring together all these people to sort of pose for your camera, recreating scenes from paintings. Those are really fascinating. Tell me about that part of your creativity.
Well, it takes it from that personal, intimate portraiture to a collaborative thing. And I there's something about collaborating with other artists, other photographers, or someone in makeup or hair, or, in a seamstress or a carpenter to make a set. So the idea, we started with Murderous Gulch. There was an alley here in Bismarck, North Dakota, which was referred to as Murderous Gulch, where there was like 14 murders had occurred in this bad alley. It was, a seedy, very seedy part of Bismarck. If you read the accounts from the Bismarck Tribune, they said that Deadwood had nothing on Murderous Gulch here from Bismarck. People just don't know about Murderous Gulch. So there's a story where one of General Custer's, remember General Custer was across the river over at Fort Abraham Lincoln, just about 5 miles away. One of his privates came into Murderous Gulch, and I think he got in a fight or something, got hurt or stabbed or something like that. And so the police would not come into Murderous Gulch. That's how bad of a place this was. But the General Custer sent the 7th Cavalry into Murderous Gulch here in downtown Bismarck to find the guy who had accosted his privates. So I knew about this. We know which alley it is. If you go to that alley, the modern day alley, nothing's there anymore. None of the old buildings have all been torn down, but we know the location. So where that location is, there's a 10-foot print of Murderous Gulch hangs there. The city hung, with the city's approval, we hung a 10-foot, and it has all the 50-some collaborators' names and stuff. So we used that alley a couple blocks away. And we just collaborated, and we built a set, and we had prostitutes, and we had bad guys, and we had guns, and we brought in straw, and we had electrical wires that we had, they didn't have electricity back then, wiring. So we ran sheets across these wires and stuff like that. So the city of Bismarck had given me permission to take over this alley, for no other reason than just to create a piece of work. So that was the first one. So it's called Murderous Gulch. If your listeners want to look that up, if you look up Murderous Gulch Webplate, you can find that. And then we did the Capsizing of Humanity, which is based off the Raft of the Medusa, which hangs at the Louvre. And it seemed kind of poignant. We came up with this name, the Capsizing of Humanity, because there's a lot of crazy stuff that's going on in the world. And so we made a raft. I had my carpenter, Jason Luder, made a raft, and then we put all these actors on it, and it was in the middle of a field. We used plastic as our water, and we had a painter paint some waves on this thing, and we made this we made the Capsizing of Humanity, which is our second largest collaboration. And then we did Liberty Trudges Through Injustice, based off Liberty Leading the People, which is also at the Louvre. With Lady Liberty in the original oil painting, she's carrying a French flag, obviously, and the French Parliament's in the background. But I made it ours by having a United States flag in her hand, and then I put the Capitol, the United States Capitol building in the background. Paul Newt painted this 8-foot wood board with the Capitol building. Yeah. And, some people accuse me of like photoshopping in the Capitol building into that shot, and it's all analog. It's all done in camera. So that, and I said, no. And I show them a picture of this. I had an 18-year-old girl holding up this big wood board in the middle of this field. You got to get that just right to actually, if you look at the shot, it's pretty believable that that's the Capitol building there, but it's nothing more. And the painting hangs here in my studio as a remembrance of that day. And then we did the Throne of the Gods, the state of North Dakota let me take over the library, the steps to the state library for the day, and we camped out there, and we did Zeus with his lightning bolt, and all Medusa and all the Artemis and all the Greek gods and stuff were at his feet. We did that shot, and then next year we missed it this year, but next year we're going to be doing addressing the plague. So we found a 15th century painting that has skeletons and coffins and bodies and all kinds of very, very dramatic scenery. And I've already got 100 people signed up for this collaboration. Wow. So there's 100 people who have already said, I will. And these are zero budget, understand. Just like that documentary you saw, that was zero budget, by the way. I mean, Greg and Chelsea, they just decided they wanted to do a 5-minute short of this documentary. It's on, just to let your listeners know, you can get it on Amazon. It's on Balkowitch, my last name. They had no budget. They were going to do a 5-minute short, and then they just started following me around. And a year and a half later, it turns into this hour-long documentary, which was zero budget. And that's what these collaborations are too. It's everyone brings something to the table. Everyone's name gets attributed to the work, and it's just a collaboration for no other. I don't make any money. I don't charge any money. I don't sell prints, and everyone just gets a limited edition signed print if you collaborated. And that's the only reason we do it, just for the sake of creating. And when does this happen? You know what I mean? Like, when does a group of citizens from a city get together and just make something important? And all the plates go up to the State Historical Society. So all those people that help me with all these large collaborations, their name gets put on the back of the plate, and that goes up to the State Historical Society. So it gives this little snapshot of what we're about and what we were trying to do here during our times. It's rather remarkable.
I think one of the kind of the interesting things that makes you sort of analogous to, the people who had their photo studios 100 and so years ago is the fact that you've become a facet of the community, that you're not just the person people go to make their photographs, that you are not just a person, personality, but that you're sort of integral to the community in which you live, and that you have relationships with people, and people have relationships with you as a result of what you do.
And it shows where we're from. You know what I mean? This is where we're from. It's about us, right? It's about what we're doing here. And that was one of the big points of my building this studio, is because it was kind of like, you build it and they will come. You know what I mean? Like, I want this studio to be the epicenter of creativity in this little, this little community, this rural community in the middle of North Dakota. I've had photographers fly in from all over the United States. I just had a gentleman in about 6 weeks ago, came in from Long Island to just do nothing but spend, Friday afternoon with my studio. We spent some time on Saturday together, and just to come in to see the process and to learn. And it's just fabulous. I never would have, how do you go from not owning a camera or having any photographic knowledge whatsoever to having photographers come into your studio from all over the place, to spend the afternoon and just to create with you. It's a huge honor. And then when they come in, there's always something to learn, right? Everyone brings something new. And if you're open to that, and you're aware of that, and you try to, I'm constantly learning. I'm trying to pick stuff up from people. There's so much to learn. There's so much to learn with photography. I don't think it ever ends,
Yeah. You said in the documentary that you're not a photographer, or at least that you weren't a photographer. Do you still adhere to that, or do you see yourself as a photographer now?
Well, in the I was hounded for years by photographers because I would say I'm not a photographer. And then it got to the point where people got pissed off at me, and they would say, "How can you say you're not a photographer?" But it all stemmed, and I'm honest about this. It all stemmed from I didn't want to insult anyone. Because at that point, I've had, very early on, within weeks of me starting my studio, photographers started flocking to my studio. It's like, these are real photographers. I mean, these people Mike Lalonde has taken pictures with a camera for 60 freaking years. You know what I mean? Like, this is a photographer, a lifelong photographer is coming into my studio. What in the heck do I have to convey? You know what I mean? Like, what do I have to give? So I didn't want to insult anyone, because I knew photographers, I knew what they knew, and I knew what I didn't know, and I just didn't want to. And it was just more, I've always considered myself more of an image maker. But I had a friend who's a photographer that I really respect. He just, he sat down with me and said, "Shane, you have to accept this." So it was kind of like beaten into me that I have to now call myself, finally I can call myself a photographer without hurting anyone's feelings or insulting anyone. So that's kind of the little story there. But it was, at one point, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of thing at one point too. I was just, I'm not really a photographer. And then people, what are you talking about? And then, it was just that kind of thing. So it was all in good spirit. But it was nothing more than I just didn't want to insult anyone that really knew photography, because I didn't.
Yeah. Well, my last question that I ask each guest is, I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that photographer be, and why?
William Mortensen, from the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s. If you look at his body of work, he was doing things. This is William Mortensen is the gentleman that Ansel Adams called the Antichrist of photography. Wow. So, I mean, if you can, what a badge of honor. You know what I mean? To have Ansel Adams. I mean, if you or I could be called the Antichrist of photography by Ansel Adams, you know what I mean? Like, that's a pretty good achievement. I mean, you should almost make T-shirts up, right? He is absolutely amazing. I've done some work based off his. He's inspired me. I put Richard Lowen on. It was called The Persecution of Complete Strangers. If you look that up on Google, The Persecution of Complete Strangers Webplate, you will see we erected, it wasn't a crucifix, but it was a pole. And we tied Richard Lowen to this pole, and we had people down below pointing at him, persecuting him. And the idea for that shot, it was based off of Mortensen work. You'll see if you look up William Mortensen, you will be happy if you look up his work, William Mortensen. And he was doing stuff in camera. There's no Photoshop back then.
I mean, he was doing multiple exposures. He would do cloud scenes. He would have buildings. I mean, if you look at his work, it's all done in camera, and he's an inspiration to me. And a lot of his stuff is really gothic and kind of a lot of nudes and a lot of really hard stuff to look at, some of the stuff, but they're just beautiful. So I don't know if your listeners know of him, but he is. If Ansel Adams calls you the Antichrist of photography, you had to have done something right in my book.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Shane, thank you so much, man. That was awesome. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. It's an honor.
Thanks to Shane for joining us. Find out more about Shane and his work by visiting sharoncole.balkowitch.com/webplate.htm. Or I've made it easy. You can always visit the show notes or the website for the link. You can find out more about Shane and his work by also watching the documentary Balkowitch, which is streaming currently on Amazon Prime. If you're a devoted listener and subscribe to the show, write us a review on whatever service you listen to podcasts. Those reviews allow us to grow. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and our mailing list. On the YouTube channel, I offer critiques on images submitted by TCF listeners like you, while the mailing list keeps you updated with all TCF events, including workshops and more. Sign up today. And remember, you can support the show by contributing to our Patreon effort or make a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal. Thanks to Jan Cohen, Holly Seaver, and Rob Feekins for their recent contributions. We also provide a series of ebooks on photography available for purchase on our website. It's my way of sharing my experience and knowledge, and another way for you to support the show. And if you can't find every episode of the show on whatever service you listen to podcasts, download the Candid Frame app, which is available for both Apple iOS and Android. And because of your generosity, it's free to download and use. No additional purchases are required. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And this is Ibadian X, and this is The Candid Frame.